Such a pleasure to welcome Jim and Deb Fallows back to Eastport. They've visited numerous times over the years, flying into our island city, and so it feels like they're old friends of the community.
Old friends.
Yes.
Yeah. and they've written numerous articles, a book, and created an HBO series about small towns across America, including Eastport, and how they face different challenges, but not only survive, but also thrive despite all the setbacks. And what we really look forward to their insights tonight on how things may have changed since then, and also how communities have really met some of these challenges. So we'd also like to welcome David Dahl, who's the editor of the Maine Monitor, an online news source, and he'll be taking questions to the fellows. So it's we have a warm welcome for you for joining us in Eastport. So let's give a warm welcome to Jim and Deb Fallows and David Dahl.
All good. Hi, everybody. Thanks for this great turnout. We've had a wonderful time here. I'm here in Eastport with our executive director, Michaela Schweitzer-Bloom, and our families. We've been a wonderful welcome here. Both of us have been here a few days in your beautiful community. We appreciate the hospitality everybody's extended to us. Thanks again for the Women of the Commons, the boat school. It occurred to me that we have many community-oriented organizations here. The Eastport Arts Center, the Quoddy Tides, the Maine Monitor, coming together to talk to two authors who are about communities. And thank you, Jim and Deb, for joining us. I was going to start with a question that asking Jim and Deb to set the scene about their book, but Jim corrected me and said, well, we should first ask how many of you all have read the book or were actually in
the book.
In the book.
I think that probably is most. Yeah.
Right.
So I figure by inference, basically everybody in Eastport is in the book because the book is about Eastport and other places. So we're glad to be with this community.
It is, you're part of the community in many ways. How many times have you been here?
We were trying to figure it out. The first time we came was in 2013, and I think it's been 5 or 6 times. We just kept coming back. We were back here with David Dahl of Marketplace, and we were back here with HBO and they were filming, and we were just back here on our own several times, which is fun. So we are actually not from away anymore. We feel, like we're kind of from here.
And can I say the very first evening we spent at Eastport was in this building. This was 10 years ago. We'd flown into the airport. As we were calling our book, we were descending the land, and the guy who was mowing the lawn at the airport moved onto the runway just at that moment because he didn't expect a plane to be coming. So we landed then after that, and we saw the performance of the Glass Menagerie in this room 10 years ago. We thought that kind of performance in this kind of town was really magical. And so that was the beginning.
That's fantastic. And so you've been back many times. What have you seen, first of all, about the changes in this community over that period of time?
So I will, our normal routine, as many of you know from experiences, I will say something and Deb will say, well, actually. So that's the setup we're going to do here. So we have seen one of the big themes about Eastport that we've heard from many of you and tried to convey in articles and the book and the movie is resilience and adaptability in the face of sort of ever-changing challenges. And so we've seen over the last decade, that's been the time where the pregnant cow business rose and fell, and the wood chip business was getting going, and the pier had its disaster a number of years ago, and COVID came, and there was harsh weather, and so we've seen the way in which the ambitions of the town have sort of changed in specific, but the long-term strategy of just finding ways to use the natural setting and the powerful sense of community, and the idea that all hands are on deck all the time, that it takes everybody to do everything, as I think Deb that will probably be your well actually point. Am I setting up for that?
You're setting up for that.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I will stop here and I give you Deb Fallows.
Yeah. So there, when we were traveling around the country, there was a word that kept popping up, which was collaboration. And the community, very large community that really was the gold standard for that, was Columbus, Ohio. They collaborated so much that they cut the syllables off that word and just said collab. That was their new word, to collab. What we've noticed during the pandemic and since the pandemic is something we actually noticed in this town too, when we were just walking down the street. I remember two things about this. One was when I was having a talk with the people at the health center, and part of their conversation was, how can we make this an easier place for the elderly people, the older people in town to walk around, because there are some hills, and it could be conceived of as a long walk to walk down the main street. And at that time it was, let's have some seating for them. And we noticed today when we were walking down the main street that each different shop had a bench that was clearly made specifically and in the imagination of what was in that shop. So to see that promise of what can we do for the citizens of the town, and that collaboration among the different businesses in the town, each to their own, and have all these chairs pop out was really nice. Yeah.
So you talk about the ingredients of success here, one of them being collaboration. As you went around the country, what were some of the other ingredients of success that you saw in cities and towns that you visited?
Again, you'll be set up for the sequence of Deb and me. So there are some things that are kind of natural endowments that communities have. Eastport has the natural endowment and the natural challenge of this exceptional setting. It truly is, just breathtaking and mind-changing to be here and look out over the bay and everything that you well know, but also the distance. The distance is part of what makes it special, and also part of what gives it challenges that some other places wouldn't have. Similar natural endowments are having somebody start a big university 100 years ago where you are, or having a river, or having other things that position you well. But it's been, I think, if I had to think of two, at the end of our book, we had 10.5 signs of civic success, which I won't go through, but one of them would be a willingness of people to dispense with any issues that might be divisive, whether they were issues of religion or ethnicity or national political alignments or whatever else, and find ways to say, in this community, what can we do that'll be good for the next generation of people, that'll make it attractive to newcomers, et cetera, that kind of practical mindedness. The other is ways to inculcate the sense that the place where you are is more, that your responsibility doesn't end at your front door, that you are responsible for what this place is going to be like 20 years from now or 50 years from now, whether it's the trees or whether it's the parks or just things that are preserving the natural environment, or something that will make it more attractive for people a generation younger than you to come. So I think practical mindedness about what can be done, and a sense that the place matters to you more than just where you're living.
And to elaborate on that just a little bit, I think it's when towns really have a sense of themselves and who they are, and what wrapped into the history of the place, and how they see the place, and how they want to pass that along to the kids. here, I would say in the time that we've been visiting Eastport, we've seen it grow from an arts community into really an arts community, that's part of the stamp of what's important to this town. How many galleries are there? I don't know. You can't even count the number, but it's, and having that grow and become a strength and kind of projecting it out to other people who come to visit and they see that is important. What we've seen in Jim's hometown of what do you do with that sense of yourself? We've seen places that work very hard and deliberately to pass that on to the next generation. In Jim's hometown, they have, which is which Redlands, California, okay. Sorry. 65,000 people. Southern California, inland California, between LA and Palm Springs. An orange growing town and a medical community town now. Every fourth grader in that town is part of a History of Redlands tour where they pile the kids onto the bus and they take them around to, this is where the first orange grove was. This is where the first founders had their houses. So then when the kids go home, they have ownership of that sense of where their town came from, and they can explain it to their parents. So somehow deliberately passing that on to the next generation seems something that is that works.
Can I pile on that for a second more too? This is something where I'm going to make the unlikely linkage between Maine and Mississippi in this way. Mississippi, we spent a lot of time in also in the so-called Golden Triangle of Mississippi of Columbus, West Point, and Starkville. Mississippi, in its way, has as strong a sense of identity as Maine does. You know, people are from Mississippi, and that's something that shapes them in ways that are good or ill. What really impressed us, and I'll try to connect this to Maine, was that this part of Mississippi recognized that to have any kind of future and to be something other than the state people made fun of and knew was going to be 50th on any kind of ranking, they had to make it attractive for other people to want to come there and to feel that new people who weren't from Mississippi, who had different backgrounds, who were disruptive in one way or another, could feel as if it was their home. And I guess that's also a common element we found lots of places of going out of one's way to make other people feel as if they can be part of it. And I mention that because, again, the sense of identity in Maine. I know that you're not from Maine unless you're from Maine for a really long time, but simultaneously having people feel as if they can be of Maine, I think is important.
So I skipped right over the title of the book, which is Our Town, and the premise of the book, which is to have traveled across the country in your small plane. How many times did you go back and forth?
100,000 miles worth.
100,000 miles worth. How many communities did you hit?
We spent time in about 50, and we wrote web posts on about 50. There were about 25 in the book and 6 in the HBO movie, of which Eastport was one.
That's great.
Yes, yes.
This is such a classic question, but what surprised you of what you expected as you launched and what you understood after 3 or 4 years, and now looking back, the book has been, when was the book published?
It came out 5 years ago.
5 years ago. So now you have that perspective as well.
Yeah.
So what was the evolution of your thought, and what's changed in the way you looked at the country?
I think at the beginning, we had no idea what to expect. It started out not exactly as a lark, but just as an open question. We had returned from China, where we had been traveling around the country as much as we could into the small rural areas, and thought we'd like to see our own country in the same way. And we had this vehicle of our small plane, which made it easy to get to small towns. Our main question was, since this was just post-recession, if we can take ourselves way back to that era of 0809, to see, so what had happened to towns, especially towns that maybe lost a factory or lost a mill or a plant? Were they doing better? Had they folded up? What was going on? So we really went went out with not very many expectations, just a big question of what's it like out there now in the country. And I think the first surprise was a gee whiz factor. We went from, Eastport was really one of the first towns, the handful of towns that we went to. And the gee whiz factor was, oh my gosh, there's so much going on in this town. People are so busy that we would split up and go our different directions in the day and come back in the end of the day. And it was always the dinner conversation, such as it was always, you're never going to believe what I saw today. Whether it was some new collaborations going on, or the strength of local institutions, or the spirit that was at all of the summer events and activities where people were participating, but not just in a kind of old-fashioned way. It was in a very progressive way of its, if we're going to bring this town back from troubles we have, we're going to do it together, and we're going to be creative about it. Carry on.
So I agree with everything Deb is saying. Words you haven't heard from her this evening. And so it was, I do think that it was in stages. When we first started doing this travel, I remember the very first place we went to was Holland, Michigan, where we happen to know some people, then Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And the surprise in both these places is you wouldn't believe how much stuff was going on in these places. All the arts, all the inventions, all the weirdo stuff. I mean, you probably we didn't know that every image you ever seen of the Earth on Google Earth or anything like that is stored in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. There's this National Aeronautics Lab there in Sioux Falls, all gets beamed down to there and has been for the last 20 or 30 years. It was in Sioux Falls for weirdo political reasons from the 1960s and 70s. That was for the same reason nuclear missiles are there, that it's protected from then Soviet bombers. But all these things happening in Sioux Falls and things happening in Holland, and then we came here. So for the first year or two, our main message in the stories we were doing was, you won't believe how much is happening all over the place, because the mainstream media narrative, I would contend, of interior US is still so much like that famed New Yorker cover of the 1970s or so, where you start on the east side of Manhattan, you see, okay, there's Fifth Avenue, and there's the Hudson River, et cetera, and then there's DC, and then there's a bunch of nothing, and there's Las Vegas, and then there's San Francisco, and that kind of is still the mainstream media narrative. And seeing just the richness of how much is happening city by city, kind of in a the only comparison we'd ever make with Tocqueville is that was the spirit of what he found, that just every place he went, there were people who were doing things. After a year or two of that gee whiz reporting, I think we moved into the, okay, where are the common patterns? And then we started systematically going to places that were harder luck, like Mississippi, and like San Bernardino, California, which is right next to where I grew up, and to Fresno, and other places where they'd had, some real hardships, and what's the range of things. And so we ended up, by the time we wrote the book, saying, here is a view of the US that most people don't. We ended up saying in the book that there's this imbalance in how people saw the country, that even then in 2018, with all the political economic turmoil at that time, most people in opinion polls felt that where they lived was doing pretty well. That, most people of different races, different regions, different economic strata felt that, but most people felt the country as a whole was going to hell. And not just because of national political strife, but because that's what they read about other places. So it was sort of giving that balanced perspective.
So are you blaming the media for that opinion of the country and the disconnect between their view of the country versus their own town? Sort of.
And I'm going to blame one of the most interesting interviews I ever had in my reportorial time was by somebody who was a pioneer of cable TV, who said the most important invention in the modern history of technology for civic life was probably the TV remote. Because before there were TV remotes, you would have to get up to turn the channel. And so there was sort of some inertia to stay with what you're saying. But once there was a remote, people would change away the instant something was not interesting. So local news discovered that people would stay to watch a car crash, a rape, a tornado, a fire, or whatever. And if you didn't have enough of those in your own town, you would have the fire in Hawaii, or you'd have the murder in the next town, or whatever. And so there was this imbalance. National crime was going down and fear of crime was going up, by extension of the remote. And I think there is something about that, about the news media in general, where people feel better about the part of the country they know directly than the part of the country they read about.
With a couple of exceptions, of course. So we're in a community that has a terrific local newspaper, the Quoddy Tides.
Yes.
And we're trying to do our part here in Washington County and around the state with our nonprofit model. But Deb, you've talked a little bit and viewed local news organizations around the country and had some favorites or some success stories that you wanted to point out?
Yeah, and I think that, what has happened in the next step of local news and community newspapers is starting to happen now, because there's been so much trouble. Not very few towns are as fortunate to have a Quoddy Tides. One of them we saw in Columbus, Mississippi, kind of the same story of the Quoddy Tides. It's the 4 generations, 100 years of the family running that newspaper, which is interestingly supported in large part by a few buildings that family happens to own in the town. So they get some revenue from that. There are lots of different models now sprouting up for what do you do about your local news? And one that comes from Muncie, Indiana, also known as Middletown of literary fame. Ball State University, also known from the ball canning industry. You all have ball jars in your houses, I'm sure, in the pantries. That was the main industry in that town, and that is the name of the university. They lost a very strong paper when Gannett brought it over, and it was hollowed out, and they didn't have enough staff to maintain that anymore. A few things happened that the university, around that same time or shortly thereafter, the public school system in the town was caving in. By every measure, it was a disaster. So the state was going to take it over. Ball State University stepped up and said, we can do that. So the university actually took over the running of the public school system. Simultaneously, the school newspaper, The Daily from Ball State, said, here is an opportunity for us to step into the gap where the town paper made a gap. And we can go in and cover what is our university doing with the school system in the town. And hey, we can do even more. We can start covering in the town. So in the last 5 years or so, that school newspaper has become the newspaper of the town, which is a really unusual but interesting model.
It's so good to see stories of those successes.
And could I interrupt for a second to clarify my remarks, as they do in DC? In talking about the problems of the media, I mean specifically to accept excellent operations like the Quoddy Tides, which is phenomenal, and the aspirations of the Maine Monitor, which is having this valuable model has been applied in other states and being applied here. So the hope for the media imbalance is with institutions like this. So we're very proud to be associated with both of you all.
Well, we're glad to have you here. Thank you very much. We didn't rehearse that at all. So Deb, I know today one of the stops, or maybe yesterday, that you made was to the library. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
So is that part of the routine when you come to a town? Is that part of what you do?
Yes, it became the routine early on when usually when we went into a town, we had done a little research. We thought there were a few storylines to follow. Usually it ended up to be something entirely different. But I discovered that one of the most important first steps to take was to go to the library, which I did again today, the PV library, which was great. Honestly, librarians know more than just about anyone else of what's going on in the town. That's their business. They're there to listen to the wants and needs of community and to serve it. So having that strength of a local institution and people who are there to really know, they have the vibe and the sense of what are the people's problems and issues, because people trust libraries. And in Bend, Oregon, they'll go there and talk about, I can't pay my rent, I can't pay my mortgage. What am I going to do about housing? Trying to live in this town, which is flourishing and becoming a go-to place, but I, as a long-term resident, can't live there anymore. There are a few people you could go to say, help me with this question, as the librarians, and they'll go to the librarians and say, can we talk about this? And then the library can respond to that kind of request and have seminars or just have the honest conversations, the sensitive conversations, whether it's about race or ethnicity or price of mortgages or price of gas, in a more civilized manner, because everybody knows they're supposed to behave well in the library and it's a place of trust. So yes, local institution number one.
I saw the sign on the way to the library today where you have to men are supposed to take their hat off and you're not supposed to chew tobacco inside that library. So are there other routines that you had when you came to a community besides the library?
This is a setup. When Deb was going to the library, I would always go to the brewery, to the brew pub. And my rationalization is, as I argued in our book, this was one sort of marker of a place that was making it, because of a certain kind of entrepreneur, a certain kind of public gathering space, a certain kind of public culture. So yes, when Deb was in the library, I'd be out having a beer.
No, but it was all good. I mean,
yeah.
Breweries are really, there's a great new brewery here, right? And we've been there already. Yeah, but they're pushing the edge of the culture of the town often, in a town like Duluth, Minnesota, which can get kind of sketchy around the edges. You get a few brew pubs into that part of town, people will follow, people will go there, and people will be comfortable there. And they bring their kids. There's a little back room where they have the book club meet. I mean, breweries, kind of like libraries, but not really, are now serve many purposes.
Very good. One more question about method. We have some artists in the crowd here. We have some writers in the crowd. What I know the answer to this from reading the book, but what was your reporting technique? What did you do at the beginning of the day? What did you do at the end of the day?
Well, we had a big plan and we had a little plan.
Okay.
The big plan was we'd have a few stories that we thought were going to develop. We'd go talk to the usual suspects, somebody in the school system, somebody in the library, somebody in a museum, maybe a town historian, kind of people who we had heard about were of the town and said, what's going on here? Who should we see? What should we talk about? And then usually our preconceived notions kind of went out the window, or certainly got changed in a big way. That was the big picture. The little picture was we would work the phones, if we were going to be there for a week or two, we'd try to make some kind of plan to meet with people and go talk to them and do our little interviews and come back and write up notes and do that every single day and try to write short pieces every single day, because if you save it up, you just can't remember it anymore. So that.
Notes at the end of the day.
That's the end of the day.
Yes, and so this is one of my somebody I had the very good fortune to be a mentee of him being my mentor back when I was starting on this business was David Halberstam, who many of you know from his wonderful books. And he just said again, no matter how tired you are, you need to write things up that day. The extreme opposite case of this is Truman Capote, who allegedly took no notes when doing it, in cold blood, and then sort of invented or recreated all of the dialogue, but just trying to type things up and then just say, what are the questions we have? As Deb was saying, we would start out with some questions about each town. what did it do when the mill closed? Why are people living in this part of down East Maine, et cetera? And then each day there were like 100 different questions that would come up, and you would start with 3 or 4 leads, and you end up with 100 people you'd like to talk to and see how far you could get down the list. You know this whole drill.
Well, yeah, but it's fun to find surprises.
Yes.
And back to one of the earlier themes we talked about here, the notion of a sort of a civic religion or a patriotism of place. You clearly found that in your enthusiastic responses and descriptions here. But at the same time, we've read and experienced a feeling of that the country is not as united as, and so what is that disconnect? And it can both be true.
Yes, one of so to start at the end and then circle back to some of my favored themes that were actually enriched by the years we spent on the road. During the years we spent in China, we were there for off and on over a period of 5 years. One of the things that we realized was that anything you could say about China would be true someplace. It was simultaneously very rich and very poor, and very kind and very cruel, and just, any set of contradictions, they all were true. Something pretty much similar is true of the US in my view. And when I was in college, I studied American history, and I wrote someplace, maybe even in this book, that really everything I've written as a reporter in the time since being in college is essentially an attempt to answer the question, is the US going to make it? Because is America going to make it? Because I think at any decade of American life, you can see the forces tearing the place apart, bringing out the cruelest and worst in people, and also the forces working against that. And so the plot line at any moment of our national existence has been that yin versus yang competition. And that is discouraging because it is always tough, but it is non-discouraging in the sense that it's always been tough. And that the long arc is from people trying harder to make things better and kinder and more inclusive and all the rest. And I think the difference between what we saw and how we were arguing people, especially over the last couple of years on national politics, is that the easiest thing for most reporters to see when they go out to some remote operation, they go to Kentucky or they go to South Dakota, they go into a diner, let's say, and ask people, what do you think about Trump? What do you think about Hillary Clinton? What do you think about things going to hell? What do you think about this or that controversy? If you ask people those polarizing questions, you're likely to get polarizing answers. If you ask them about something else, you're likely to get the much more three-dimensional richness of their actual lives. And so I think both those things are true. It's a very difficult civic time for our country for reasons that are evident to all of us, but the resilient fiber is evident to people usually where they live, and they should know that it's that way other places too, where other people live too.
So part of the answer to this, too, I agree with what Jim said, is
mark this down. Yeah.
We decided early on that we were going to towns to find out what was going on in towns. So we deliberately did not ask the national political questions because we knew what the answers were going to be. So we would ask the questions of the what's going on in your town that's important to you questions. And it was like turning on a fire hose. People didn't answer in national terms. They answered in community terms of what they were doing. And that's why this was informative. And up until, well, I'll just stop right there. And I think that one of the things that came out in that kind of question and that kind of answer was that people have a sense of agency where they live, that I can do something in this town that matters and will have consequences. One of the phrases we heard, if we heard it in towns as small as Eastport and in cities as big as Columbus, Ohio, 500,000 people or more, this town is the perfect size. It's big enough that there's lots going on. It's small enough that I can have an impact
And
here.
they would say that no matter how.
No matter how big the
It
town
was
is.
15,000 or
Yeah,
5,000.
yeah. But that's not the answer you necessarily get if you talk about national issues.
And just to pile on that, something about ethics of journalism, or the shared trait of many people in this room. If you're coming from DC or New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, and you're going to any place outside the big metropolises, and you're asking people their views on what do you think about this or that national issue, there's a power imbalance. You're asking them about things in which they are not expert and you are the presumed expert. If you're asking them what's happening with the pregnant cow business, what's happening with the schools here, what's happening with your water situation, people are talking about the areas of their expertise, of their life, which everybody is expert in, and you're learning from them, which I think is a better position for a reporter to be in.
So did your view of the country change since the book was published to now? And how so?
Yeah, there are two answers for this. One is that when we started this reporting in 10 years ago, over the first few years, especially when we would go back to our hometown of Washington, D.C., or also New York, or also L.A., pick your big town, the reaction to what we were doing was, that's so cute. Or you must be cherry picking, or oh, not really. It was very patronizing and condescending. Not in the towns where we visited, who were, I want to talk to you, but in the big towns. We saw that change over time, and especially, by the time the book came out, it wasn't completely changed, but like the ground had been softened up and there had been enough stories out there, not just by us, but by other people. It was, so the reception was,
Thank you so much.
oh, thanks.
Thanks. Thank you.
It was like, we didn't have to be so insistent about this message anymore. People.
It was resonating. Well, your book was a
resonating.
bit of success then. Your message was getting out.
So it's, in a way, we feel that the conventional wisdom has changed, and that's been really heartening. Where now people assume that yes, local journalism is the place we need to foster because it's so important. And the cities are the place where democracy is being rebuilt, et cetera. Of course, the other big change is the pandemic,
right?
And that was what you're going to say.
That was what I was going to say next. Is that as we are all beginning to learn, that changed everything. Yeah. And one of the fundamental ways it changed, as we all know, is that people were at home, sitting around, thinking about their lives, trying to assess what's really important to me. What am I going to do with the rest of my life that counts? Getting, out of the everydayness of what you do. And what we've seen, and I think you've seen here too, is that people are coming up with these fundamental, basic, really good ideas of, this is where I'm going to spend my time. And a lot of it is community oriented. If you have, I bet you have a bunch of artists who are coming to town because they think that this will be a good place for them and that they can contribute and that that's important to them. We've seen a lot of changes in that kind of fundamental way. People moving around, finding new places, thinking I can do this, and it might be hard, but I'm gonna do this because this is the rest of my life.
So I have a couple wrap-up questions, and then we have questions out in the crowd, and I think we have some questions out with our Zoom audience. I know that you just flew back from California, right?
In our little plane.
In your little plane, your beloved little plane.
Yes.
You can wax on about your plane. I'd love to hear about it. But what's next for you all and for the plane?
Those of you who are pet owners know the phenomenon of the dog is upstate where he'll be happier. where's the dog? So the plane sooner or later will be upstate where it'll be happier. We've for 23 years, we've had the privilege of owning a beautiful little airplane. There'll come a time when it no longer makes sense to own a little airplane because our kids don't live within little airplane range. We're not doing the city by city travel. So eventually our little plane will go upstate, which will mean, it'll mean Dayton, Ohio, which is the main place where planes of our sort go to go upstate. Steel Aviation is the main broker for airplanes, but a pilot's license has lifetime validity as long as you remain proficient. We are continuing. We started a little foundation called the Our Towns Foundation, where we're continuing reporting on this kind of theme, and just we'll continue doing that. And I'm doing other writing on various topics. Yes. How about you, Deb?
Yeah, I mean, we could go from town to town for the rest of our lives, or as long as Jim's still a pilot, but I think we're not going to do that in the same way anymore. We don't have to do that anymore. It's wonderful and we love doing that, but I think that our mission has changed somewhat to go down to look into certain topics that we think that we have passion about, and I think are important in the future in towns in the country and everybody in the world. Certainly environment and sustainability is one. Local journalism is another. Local institutions is another. How important it is to have those core things. So instead of the ethnographies of towns, I think we've won that battle. But there are a lot of more.
And a lot of very big, well-financed institutions are, to the nation's benefit, getting, in the movement of trying to support local journalism, local sustainability, local educational renewal. And a lot of them are coming to us saying, can you tell us where we should go, what we should do? So we're involved. We're having the luxury of the leverage of a lot of big institutions who we're advising informally.
Yeah, and we can't really compete with them
and don't need to.
Right.
So why don't I open this up a little bit? I'm not sure if we're mic'd or we could just do it from the seats. Questions, hands up, please. I can't see too well here. I see one hand there, please. Yes.
So I'm curious, you spent a lot of time on Eastport. Have you looked at the chalice?
And I think you have to name your hometown before you ask the question. Okay. Okay.
We're here, and chalice.
Why didn't you do my town?
We have heard all about the Calais Eastport conundrum and connection here, and how if you're from one, you're from there and not really from the other. We don't know as much about Calais, I will confess. I'll say the one place we're able to sort of bridge this gap is I'm from the town of Redlands, California, which is between San Bernardino and Riverside, and we were able to have the whole trifecta of an Inland Empire special as part of our movie. But I will confess, we don't yet know enough about Calais to say more than I just have.
Okay. Good question. Okay. Whoever's back there, please. Okay.
Your town, and did you have a designated time that you were going to be there, or was it kind of open depending on what you were finding?
I'm going to repeat the question. How did you pick the town, and did you have a designated time when you would land in that particular town?
A lot of it was haphazard. At the beginning, it started out because we had a few friends, one in Holland, Michigan, and one in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We knew would kind of get what we were trying to do. So we wanted to start someplace where we had a little bit of a connection.
Right.
And after that, after the gee whiz and after starting to see the patterns, we thought, okay, we needed maybe to try a couple big towns as proof of concept. We needed to go some, as Jim said, some really hard scrabble towns. And we needed to get around to different geographic areas of the country. But those things came to us in funny ways. One was Columbus, Mississippi, where we went. We had been in Greenville, South Carolina, reporting on a governor's school, public boarding school, sponsored by the state. The one in Greenville was Governor's School for Arts and Humanities. So I was writing a little piece about it. And I got an email one morning from a teacher in Columbus, Mississippi. His name is Thomas Easterling. He taught English. He said, I'm an English teacher at the Mississippi School, Governor's School of Science and Mathematics. You think that school in Greenville is so great? You got to come here. So we thought, okay, we're going there. Now that's going to be an interesting story. So, it's a variety of things. This took a long time. We were years in that plane.
2014 to 2017?
So we started in the summer of 13 and we wrote the book, started writing the book 4 years later. Yeah. So it was like half time over 4 years.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So that evolved. We didn't really know how long we'd stay, at least a week, because it had to be at least a week. And then we'd go back, or sometimes we'd stay longer. So it just kind of rolled.
Good. So I have a question from Scott in our audience out in the internet world here. A little bit of a repeat of a question, but with an addition. What are the common threads of success among the communities that you visited? But specifically, was the preservation of the town's history and its buildings one of those? And that's a relevant question for sure here in Eastport as well.
So one of the markers, again, I think it's become commonplace, but it came as sort of a news to us when we started it 10 years ago, is how very important it is to have a downtown and how much easier it is to have a sort of successful downtown if you haven't bulldozed the downtown that was there. It's amazing that the United States has a lot of attractive downtown architecture, especially, Eastport and a lot of places in the Northeast have it older than that. But for most of the country, essentially from the Civil War until World War II, there was a lot of really beautiful classical downtown architecture in that 100-year period. And the question is, how much of it was torn down in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to make parking lots and interstates and banks with no windows and all that. And so one of the, I know that Eastport has had fires and other disasters here, but just walking down the main street today, we were thinking how beautiful the buildings are. And just the fact that not all of them are in their full economic vitality at the moment. Not all of them are at the peak of their condition, but they're all there. And the bones are there for a really beautiful downtown. So I think it's become, you don't see as many cases now of towns just recklessly bulldozing some old building and putting up some ugly, unsightly new thing. So there is that patrimony.
Great. Question from the audience here. Go ahead. Yes. Help me out here, Paula.
Okay, over here. Yes.
Okay, well, so now I have heard that as a result of the pandemic and people deciding they didn't have to live in San Francisco, they didn't have to pay those high rents. A lot of people moved here and to other small towns where they could work remotely. And have you seen some sort of dynamic change
I'm going to repeat the question.
as a result?
Again, I'm going to repeat the question for everybody to hear. So the question is, have we seen a change? Have Jim and Deb seen a change? Basically a pandemic effect on people moving out of the cities into smaller communities. Frankly, we've covered this on the Monitor a few times in Washington County and around the state. There's been a lot of new residents that have moved to Maine, as many of you know. Have you seen that effect in your travels?
Definitely we've seen that effect, and we've seen an interesting response from the towns, which is, this is great. This can be great for it. where it seems to work. Well, it works in the towns that people go to because, they have a reason to like that town and to go there, but people seem to be pitching in to make it work. They have to figure out big and little things like, we better get a new coffee, we better get a coffee shop. But if there's already a coffee shop, what does that mean? How is that going to be seen as competition or collaboration? What do we do about that? So there are just some adjustments to be made. And we have to spiff up the parks because the city people are coming here because they want a place for their kids to roam around and have a good time. And we'd like that for our kids too. So let's pay attention to the park. So it kind of changes a lot of the decision-making and focus of the towns to accommodate the new people whom they want there, but who have different, who are making different demands, perhaps. So it's a challenge, but a welcome challenge, I would say.
I'll put a point on that a little
Yeah.
bit. So is there tension between people who might have been here for a long time and the new people who are coming?
Oh,
We've
sure.
seen examples of that.
Yeah.
Yes, we have, and so to answer your question directly, and then to give a little speechlet indirectly, the effect, like everything, is complicated. San Francisco commercial real estate is in trouble lots of places, in Manhattan, in San Francisco, in LA, in DC, where we live. And every place, big and small, is sort of dealing with the recalibration of who's moving back. Do tech companies want people present again? What's going to be the long-term equilibrium? Here's my little speechlet that I would put this in. I think there are these markers in American history where the settlement pattern really changes. It really changed in the late 1800s when immigrants were coming in from around the world and industrialization was beginning. Detroit was the fastest growing city in the Western Hemisphere in the early 1900s. It changed in the 1910s, 1920s with the great Black migration from the South. It changed during the Depression. It changed after World War II. It changed with the rise of the Sun Belt. And I think the pandemic is going to be another one of those just markers where the settlement pattern will change. I think there's going to be a dispersal of people living where they want to live and where they want to raise their children. And it's not going to mean that San Francisco or New York goes away, but just the equilibrium is different.
Question from our digital audience. Richard is asking a question that is quite relevant here and maybe in other states, which is the role of conserved natural spaces, not just natural spaces, but conserved natural spaces, and in building a community. Parklands managed by local land trusts. How has that played out in some of the communities where you've been?
We've seen a lot of attention toward, I'm going to call them natural assets, where I think that people, either the residents or the new people or the times, people appreciate that that the land should be used well. It's part of the whole kind of awareness of environment and sustainability. We have a saying in our house that we developed, which was, after visiting a lot of towns, every town seems to have a river walk. Even if it doesn't have a river, it has a river walk. And having that trail, or the way bike trails are being connected and developed, is certainly one. And it is part of this change too, of the people who are coming here expect that, but we expect that too. It's the same thing, the phenomenon of swimming pools or splash pads for kids, parkland, definitely trails. And one of the reasons I particularly love these open spaces is that they are not exactly a gathering place. They are an opportunity for people to mix and mingle. In our town of Washington, D.C., when I go to the public pool or when I am on the bike trail, I see people I wouldn't normally see in my everyday life. You know, in DC, I hear different languages, but I see different ethnicities and I see different socioeconomics in those public spaces. Everybody's there, and you become aware of the layers of your community in a different way. So, you know, they're great, not just for fun, but for kind of open your eyes.
Great.
I agree.
Other questions here? Wait.
Your study and the 25 in the book, did they all have airports, and did any of them use them in the 10 years?
So this, Jim's very excited about this question. I can already sense it. The question is did the town, the communities that they visited and that were in the book, did they all have airports, and have they since lost the airport in any cases?
We had a bias in favor of cities that had airports because that's how we were visiting them. So I think all the, and for those of you who are either are or aspire to be pilots in the crowd, and everybody should aspire to, the US is really unique in the world. There's almost 5,000 small airports in the US, which is, in China has only about 150. And it's, you know, it's about the same geographic scale as the US. And so the US really, and all the pilot and aviation organizations are always on the defenses when they're closed down, and they are being closed down in a number of places. There are a couple near my hometown in Redlands that were closed, but there still are a lot of them. And I'm not aware of any. I know for your airport here, where we've landed many times, was closed for like 6 months when the runway was being redone. But that's it's now there in fine form. So I'm not aware of any that closed on our watch.
No, I'm not either. And there are some that have opened. The former Air Force bases
Yes.
that have closed
Yeah.
are
Usually
now,
converted into
Yes.
corporate.
Yeah.
Thank you. I see this gentleman in the, or somebody in blue here, right here. Go ahead.
My interest, or one of my great interests, is education and how schools in communities, and besides teaching the basics, can bring this community together. And I think the fact that we had this remote learning for several years, we probably helped sort of stir up some of the old traditional chalk and talk types of education. And here in Eastport, we have such a rich community of talents and resources that which many of you brought in mind and new people moving here. But it's such an opportunity for the children to get a sense not only of the history, but of the future of what they're going to have to deal with. And for this wonderful arts community, it's a very rich bed of resources for us. What intrigues me is that the creativity is not just painting and sculpture and whatnot, but it's in everyday life, and it's teaching the children, teaching and bringing to them that sense of agency that they can create, they can solve problems in the community, and really just changing the way education is presented. I think the Oak School is a prime example that we've been trying to get together with the school system to develop some of the skills that we can teach. So
The question generally is about the importance of education. We talked about a lot of the important ingredients here, and about how what students are taught in schools about their own place, their sense, give them a sense of place. Was there a specific example in any of the communities?
About Greenville,
Yeah.
and also Fresno.
yeah. Greenville, South Carolina is a really interesting example of that. Of course, it used to be a mill town. And now it's GM,
GE and BMW.
GE, BMW, and
Michelin.
Different, and Michelin. Yeah, so it's a kind of curiously international community, but very high tech, very engineering. And what the town has done is with the kind of public-private partnership of those industries and the school system, built an amazingly strong core of STEM and now STEAM, including the arts, curricula in brand new schools or infiltrated in a good way into the old schools, where young workers in those big corporations will actually go into the schools and teach classes little bitty kids about, there's a school called the A.J. Wittenberg School, Elementary School of Engineering. And they start out from pre-K all the way through, to 6th grade. Everything is kind of fashioned around in the curriculum of engineering, and the young, not faculty, but visiting teachers from GE and Michelin and
BMW.
the other one, BMW, will go into the classroom. So it is
So
part of the background.
corporate or the folks from those companies are
That's
coming
right.
into the classrooms.
They are, and now they've expanded it into middle schools and high schools, and it's a smart thing for the companies too, because they're training all these little bitty engineers who are going to stay there and work.
Tiny.
Mhm.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Couple in the back.
Hi, y'all. Wondering, and honestly, I just can't remember from my time reading the book and after watching the film. I just don't remember if this was the case. Eastport, for me, is unique in its geographic juxtaposition up against the Quoddy Reservation and the Quoddy community. And I'm wondering if in your travels and learnings about the PH communities you visited, did you find any similar juxtaposition?
So the question has to do with any similarities between the situated geography of Eastport vis-a-vis the Passamaquoddy Reservation. Is there a parallel in other communities that you found?
So thanks for asking that. And we did talk about that somewhat in the book, and there were scenes in the movie that are with the Passamaquoddies. I think the place that is most parallel in our experience is the town of Ajo, Arizona. That's AJO, which is in very far southern Arizona. It's sort of straight south of Phoenix until just about you hit the Mexican border by the Organ Pipe National Monument or whatever. And interestingly, so Ajo's history was as a coal mining town or a copper mining town. It's a gigantic, looks like a meteor crater that actually was the open pit copper mine there for a long time, which closed. And it now is reviving itself as an arts community, but it's conscious of what it calls its tri-national identity. There's the US identity, there's the Mexican identity, which has always been an important part of the culture, and there's the Tohono O'odham identity, which I think a very large, these used to be known as the Papago tribe, is now Tohono O'odham, and they have a very large reservation that goes right up to the border of the town. So that's a place we've seen where this, and it's tri-national as Eastport is too, of course, with the US, Canada, and the Passamaquoddy. So I think there are a number of communities, those in South Dakota also are involved in this, where being aware of the different nationalities and histories is an important part of the city's identity.
Yeah, and in Ajo, they have also addressed the wrongs that happened during the copper mining area among the nationalities, and it is you still you can feel tension in the town, and it's a very tiny town. Well, it's a very tiny town, but it is quite similar in those respects of really trying to reach out and understand and address and not bury what has happened and where it should go in the future.
So a question that builds a little bit on that, having to do from one of our audience members, Pam, who we've talked about successes, we've talked about ingredients, and ability to put aside polarization. But there are polarizing issues. You just touched on one, but others at the local level, controversies in libraries, for example, about books. You're a library fan. Can you point to an example of a community that had to manage a tough issue like that? There might be national implications to it, but it starts locally.
You read about that with some libraries recently.
Yeah, I think, so I went back to talk recently to a number of the librarians in towns where I had some relationships about what's happening with the book challenges. And it's everywhere. And I was talking to Dana this morning about the same issue, and she said in Eastport there haven't been any book challenges yet, which is, you know, I get that answer half the time, but in other towns it's all different layers of yes, and it's been severe, to oh, we've had a few. But the response from the library community, as you might expect, is really interesting in Eastport as well. We are ready. We have our processes. We know what we're going to do exactly if someone comes in challenging a book or raising a ruckus. Here are the steps that we go through. And I think that anticipation has gone a long way toward diffusing eruptions, because they're actually training. I'm not explaining.
So a clear, transparent process that is in place before the controversy arises, so people kind of know at least how to handle it on the front
and
end.
the people in the library have been trained on how to handle it. They know the steps to take, which seems to be very effective.
Okay.
Not what you're going to see on cable news shows about people barging into the council meetings or the library board meetings.
Is your re-interviewing of the librarians a part of what the next project might be?
Yes, I'd say that's exactly right.
Yes.
Can I just pile on for 1 second more? Obviously, this local level resilience matters tremendously. Also, larger scale leadership matters, whether leaders at the national and state level are having a calming or an inflammatory message.
Yeah, and also one thing about the libraries is that the big national library organizations, American Library Association, they have their playbook, they have their rules, they're already written. So it also makes it easier for local libraries one by one to say, our national institution has this constitution that says, here is what we stand for, and here is how we're going to defend it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that?
In the back.
Yeah, my question, piggyback rides on so are you staying in touch? What is your process to stay in touch with the storylines you presented to us in the book, as well as the people you featured in your movie? Is this going to be your next project? What is the process there?
The question is are Jim and Deb going to be staying in touch with the folks they interviewed for the book or interacted with for the movie? There were probably, I didn't get a total number of people you interviewed, but I bet there are quite a few. That's a lot of emails. It's a long Christmas card list. How are you going about doing that?
We have stayed in touch with an amazingly high proportion of people who we've met over the past decade. And so Eastport, of course, is special, but there's a lot of other places where we know a lot of people too. And it's been, really enriching to just be able to stay in touch with as many people. And so we do plan, we're not going to, go see another 100 towns in our airplanes, but we are continuing to write about these themes and finding the most effective way to do it.
That's great. I've got one here, but is there somebody, we can probably do a couple more?
Yeah.
Yep.
Right there.
Yes. Welcome and welcome back.
Thank you.
My question is, do you have any general commentary on the difference in communities regarding the presence of social media in those communities?
So it's a question about social media, and do you have an opinion about the differences in communities and how they're handling social media, or how social media might be affecting different communities?
I'll take the easy answer on that, which is in many small communities, especially ones that don't have a local news organization of any sort, social media is where news gets around. Facebook is the newspaper in some places, like I'm thinking of a whole bunch of the towns in Northwest Ohio where we were. We're not Facebook fans, I'm putting it out there. But it has it serves its best purpose in my opinion, in situations like that, where it can present news and keep people in touch and tell them things that are going on and give them a place to be. You take the hard part.
So I'm going to weasel out of the hard part, saying that there's lots of issues I have opinions on. I don't know enough about this really to have a judgment or opinion. Part of it is because I mentioned earlier one of my embarrassing traits that you'll always find me in a brewery. Another is I have never had a Facebook account, and I have never looked at anything on Facebook. I object so much to Facebook that I have never dealt with it, and I know that cuts me off from a tremendous amount of material. For example, we spent a lot of time in the Philippines. Facebook is the medium of the Philippines, and I'm not in touch with anybody in the Philippines because I won't go on Facebook. So one of the consequences is I don't have a good answer to this excellent question.
What do you think, David?
Yeah, yes. Yes.
There's a robust Facebook community here in Washington County, and one of my friends here is involved in that. I was sort of surprised at how robust Facebook is in some of these communities here in Maine, as compared to Boston, which is where I was before this, where Facebook is, people have sort of moved past Facebook. I haven't seen as much hate on Facebook as we sort of know about. Twitter seems to be a complete mess, or X is what it's called now, I guess. So I have a question from the audience, and then I have a final wrap up for me, okay? Did I successfully dodge that question? So there was a book, gosh, it must be, you will know this title, 15, 20 years ago, called Bowling Alone. And the concept, I believe, and help me here, Jim and Deb, was the idea that people were sort of walling themselves off, that they weren't interacting with their communities. Some of this now is affected by the pandemic, I think. We're in this post-pandemic era, but how the concept of bowling alone, people being separate from their community, is that still a thing or not?
Would you like me to answer this, Deb? So Robert Putnam, great sociologist, author of Bowling Alone, also from the same area of Northern Ohio as Deb is from, small town Northern Ohio. Many of you, I'm sure, have read this book, whose thesis was he compared I think he was a little older than a baby boomer, but the bowling leagues he remembered from Northern Ohio in the 1950s had gone away. And so people were bowling alone. This was a proxy for lots of erosion of community. And one time when we were in the middle of our travels, I was on some panel with a symposium with him. And he was talking about this and giving some examples from some towns. And I asked him if he'd actually been to these towns. And some of them he had not, but he had a researcher who had told him about it, et cetera. And so my answer was, you should get out more. And that this is the erosion of lots of kinds of social, and I say this with enormous respect for Robert Putnam and all the things he has done. And this was a good-natured repartee between us. That lots of the things that were fabrics in the post-World War II era, from scout troops and bowling leagues and little league and sports that were not traveling sports for high school teams, et cetera. Those things have changed, and there's lots of indication that has meant real fragmentation and isolation. There's lots of new things that are arising now too, including bowling among the young people. That bowling is becoming more popular again. And so I think it's a question again of the forces of creation, destruction, and creation. And so, yes, that window on American life was very important, remains very important. And the question is whether people are doing other things together now.
And I think the answer is yes. I mean, we're more of the Tocqueville answer of if you want to do something, find a group, collaborate with people and make an organization. We've seen, I think that's something else that has come out post-pandemic is finding like-minded people in whatever it is that you think is important is just like mushrooming.
Yes.
Well,
let's not get into the pickleball debate here.
Right.
So let me do a wrap-up question and express our thanks here. So this will be reductive, but more optimistic, less optimistic for the country in having completed the book and lived now past the book 5 years. Deb, you look troubled.
It depends.
Yeah.
In a community sense, in an everyday sense, and in everyday lives that we're talking about here, I am optimistic. I'm more optimistic because I've seen more. And I think it is a trait and strength of the American spirit that people will not, that people will stand up and speak their mind and create an answer, try to create an answer to something that they see needs changing. So in that way, I'm very optimistic.
Problem solving at the local level.
Yes, and that people seem to know how to do it, and they've seen so many examples of this happening, especially, well, I don't know, it's going on generationally too, so that is optimistic. Everybody starts a group, everybody wants to be a startup, so
a prelude to my arguing for optimism is my thanking the institutions represented here this evening. The Maine Monitor, the Quoddy Tides, and the Commons, and the Boat School, and the Arts Center, and others I'm forgetting, and something like 10% of the population of Eastport, here this evening. So I'm really, I take all of that seriously. And again, from my starting point of thinking that the soul of the country is always in battle, and there's always a struggle, I think the last 5 years are an argument for the forces of reconciliation and healing and moderation getting the upper hand. But it's always contingent. So we have to keep trying to have them keep the upper hand.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to you both. This is a little gift from Monica's Chocolates.
Ooh,
So there you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming back to Eastport again. And Michaela and I want to thank everybody. And we also want to thank everyone on behalf of the groups that are represented here. Mika and I will be downstairs to answer any questions that you might have about the Maine Monitor. And I know you have other things to say.
Yes. Let me borrow this. I don't know, how's it come out? There we go. What a wonderful evening this has been. You think so? My name is Paula Horvath, and myself and Catherine Lee, who introduced this evening, are both members of the EAC's board of directors. We're also the co-leaders of the writers group here at the EAC, and we really believe that words matter. One of the questions that newcomers to Eastport always get asked, it seems, is how did you find Eastport? How did you find out about it? And for most people, it's serendipity. I was talking to a newcomer just a couple weeks ago. And I asked them that very question. How did you find Eastport? And they said, it's a book I read. It was a book about all these different towns in the United States. And that's why I came to Eastport. So indeed, words do matter. And thank you, both of you, Deborah and James Fallows, for sharing your words with us tonight. I also want to again thank two of the great news media organizations in the state who sponsored this tonight, and that is our local Quoddy Tides and the Maine. Also, thanks to my organization and to Meg Colbert, who is the executive director and really, really helped put this all together. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Thank you to the Women of the Commons, two special organizations here in town. And now I'd like to invite all of you to come downstairs and join us and meet everyone here on the stage tonight to tell them how much you appreciate them and how much you agree that words matter.